Hi, I'm Jamie Poisson. A few weeks ago, John Rustad, who's running to be Premier of British Columbia, was giving a press conference about his plans to let people write off some of their mortgage interest or rent. It's an out there enough policy that it would normally garner lots of questions. But instead, when it came to the Q&A portion, Rustad really lost control of the narrative. Practically all of the questions from journalists were about a video released the day before, where he called the COVID vaccine the so-called vaccine. He also said he regretted getting it.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think would have happened in BC if people didn't get the shots, and are you suggesting that everything would have been the same in terms of death and illness rates without widespread vaccinations?
So, thank you for that, and I see the NDP are attacking me about this.
Do you believe the vaccine science?
So, look, clearly, in my opinion, what needs to be done in this province is we need to make sure that our healthcare system is good, that it's available.
Can you just please explain to voters why you said you would get the 3 doses of the COVID vaccine?
Like I say, this is David Eby's attempt to hide from his policies and approaches and his failures in British Columbia.
The whole thing captured a lot of what's gone on in the lead up to the election on Saturday. Controversial and conspiracy-laden comments that Rustad and also a bunch of his conservative candidates have made have taken up a lot of the oxygen. For many, it's been quite surprising to see him in such a tight race to be BC's next premier against sitting NDP Premier David Eby. A lot of that, as we've talked about on the show and we'll get into today, has to do with the collapse of the BC United Party, formerly the BC Liberal Party, which really opened the door for Rustad and his party's rise. One day out from the election, my colleague, BC Provincial Affairs reporter Katie DeRosa is here, and we're going to go through all the political drama. Katie, hi. It's such a pleasure to have you on Front Burner.
Good morning, Jamie.
So I want to start by talking about BC Conservative leader John Rustad. So as I mentioned in the intro, lots of headlines about how Rustad has said all of these controversial things about climate change. He doesn't think it's an existential threat, and COVID, he regrets getting the vaccine. But tell me more about Rustad and what these more controversial moments tell us about him as a politician.
Well, John Rustad is not a newbie to politics. He was elected under the BC Liberal banner in 2005. He's been a Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He's been a forestry minister when the Liberals were in power. And then he was under the Liberal banner when Kevin Falcon was leader. However, in 2022, Kevin Falcon actually ejected John Rustad from the BC Liberal caucus because John Rustad shared a post on social media that was seen as climate skepticism. And Kevin Falcon says that has no place in our party. And ironically, that was the start of the downfall of the BC Liberals, who then renamed as BC United. It allowed John Rustad to join the dormant BC Conservative Party. It had no seats in the legislature, but John Rustad became the BC Conservatives' first MLA. He defected. Basically became the party leader and then picked up another MLA. And so that sort of was the start of momentum of the BC Conservatives in early 2023.
Since becoming leader last year, Rustad has been galvanizing the right and fast. As the sole BC Conservative in the House, he attracted more MLAs from his old party and support.
And I think his rise is really tied to the rise and the popularity of federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He is kind of a quiet guy. He's this unassuming presence. He's not bombastic. Probably people underestimated him. And so then we saw, as the BC United was struggling with its own rebranding, that allowed Rustad to, and the Conservative Party of BC, to in the background be talking to more MLAs, trying to bring them over. And that led to, in August, Kevin Falcon folding the party and allowing John Rustad to just completely unite the right, as they said.
Amid low polling and fundraising challenges, BC United is suspending its campaign and asking supporters to back the BC Conservative Party and leader John Rustad.
There is nothing more important to me and my children and your children and grandchildren that we not give the NDP one more day in power.
United is withdrawing its candidates' nominations, and Kevin Falcon is no longer running.
And that has allowed, John Rustad to now be where he is, which is neck and neck with the NDP in the polls.
And just for people who might not follow BC politics super closely, how shocking was that development?
It was quite a shocker, and I'm hearing from a lot of centrist voters or centrist, organizers, politicians who say they are seeing more of a polarization. The BC Conservatives further to the right than the BC Liberals and then the BC United were, and then the NDP they're characterized more on the left. However, they have moved to the center because of some of the popularity of the BC Conservatives, such as David Eby saying that he would abandon the carbon tax if the federal backstop was removed.
I think it's critical to also recognize that the context and the challenge for British Columbians has changed. A lot of British Columbians are struggling with affordability.
Saying that he would be in favor of more mandatory detention for people with mental health and addiction issues.
We know that the current response that we offer is not adequate. And increasingly, I'm concerned that the way that they are interacting in our communities is making everybody less safe.
So we have seen the NDP shift a bit to the center. And again, that is a credit to the BC Conservative message really landing.
Yeah, I want to get into that more with you in a minute, but just to stick with Rustad for a moment, on some of the more controversial stuff that he said, the climate change stuff, the COVID stuff, what does he say when he's questioned about that?
I think during this campaign, it's been hard to know exactly where John Rustad stands versus what maybe some of his policy people are pushing. I do think it is a tough to nail down where Rustad stands on some issues.
So after I had the second shot of the COVID vaccine, about 6 weeks later, I actually had a heart problem. And through a process, when I went in and talking to health officials, the question they had for me was only one word: Moderna. And to me, that tells me that there has been some issues. And so from that perspective, I do regret getting the COVID vaccines.
And Rustad isn't only being asked to respond to his own controversial comments. He's also being asked about controversies that are cropping up for his party's candidates. And just tell me about some of those.
Well, a big one in the last week has been a BC Conservative candidate in Surrey South named Brent Chapman. There was one post where he called Palestinians inbred, walking, talking time bombs, literally and figuratively. That's his words. And of course, that just shook the Muslim community, the Palestinian community. He apologized for that. He hasn't done any interviews since those statements. He sent a written statement. One of our CBC reporters went to his constituency office. He sat in his car, would not come out. Of course, now there's a video of a Global reporter going into his constituency office. He also would not come out, refused to talk.
Mm-hmm. He appeared to be hiding in one of the rooms. Right?
Yes, he was. So it's a bad look. And John Rustad has been asked repeatedly about it. He says he's apologized. They were posts from 10 years ago. However, another post has surfaced, more recent, 2017, where Brent Chapman expressed skepticism of mass shootings in the U.S. and the Quebec mosque shooting. So, again, very conspiracy theory views in line with this Alex Jones in the U.S. And again, he will not answer to that other than a written statement. And John Rustad, again, has not asked him to step down.
It's not just Chapman, right? Take me through a few of the other examples.
Well, so there's another BC's Conservative candidate, Chris Sankey, in northern BC. He linked the COVID vaccine to AIDS. There has been another candidate who basically said that women who don't breastfeed are not really mothers. Yes, there's been a lot of posts that have come back to haunt some of the candidates.
Controversies aside, this is really a very tight race. So obviously, Rustad and the BC Conservatives are putting forward some ideas that people like. Is it the conspiracy stuff or is it other stuff?
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of people are just ignoring the conspiracy stuff. They say that doesn't matter, that I can put that aside as long as I see lower taxes, as long as the carbon tax is done, as long as I get some sort of rebate to help with my daily costs. So, I do think it's hard to know to what extent some of these more embarrassing incidents coming up, to what extent they're landing with individuals who are just frustrated with daily life. They're frustrated with persistent crime. And of course, the BC Conservatives have really focused on the public safety issue and really just affordability.
People around this province have been telling me enough is enough. It's time to put the rights of citizens before the rights of criminals in British Columbia.
EB has been asked several times over this campaign, are you out of touch with people? You keep saying that, some of your policies are eventually going to work, but they're not helping people right now. And EB has really tried to be careful to say, I understand people are frustrated. I know that, people are struggling to afford rent and they're struggling to afford groceries. But he's trying to put forward the message that we could stay with the NDP and we will address some of these concerns. So that's some of the tension that we've seen, is who can be the better shepherd of the economy and of some of these social problems that we're seeing in BC. And again, that's going to be decided by voters.
I did find it interesting, since fiscal responsibility has been such a big part of this campaign. Rustad released his costed platform on Tuesday, right? And it showed, I believe, that the BC Conservatives would run a deficit even higher in the short term than the NDP. Can you explain that to me?
Yes, so people were waiting for the BC Conservative platform because there were a lot of promises early in the campaign, billions of dollars worth of bridges and SkyTrains and infrastructure promises that a lot of people were wondering, where is this money going to come from? We're already in a $9 billion deficit. And so the platform showed $2.3 billion in additional spending over 2 years, and that doesn't include an additional $4 billion a year in tax cuts. There was a lot of, eye-watering thing looking at that figure. And I think an easy line of attack for the NDP is that, well, there's going to be cuts that you just haven't told us about. And so the big focus is, yesterday, both leaders were in Nanaimo and not in the same place, but they were trading barbs over whether or not Rustad is going to cut healthcare. EB accused Rustad of wanting to bring in U.S.-style two-tier healthcare where people can pay to skip the queue. Rustad says that's not true, but I think a lot of the focus is, what would have to be cut in order to deliver the budget that the Conservatives are pitching.
I want to spend a bit of time focusing specifically on EB here, who was BC's Attorney General before becoming Premier. He's been in power now for almost 2 years. And just take me through his road to Premier and a bit of his tenure.
Yeah, well, as a minister, EB was kind of seen as the fix-it guy. He had called ICBC, our public auto insurer, a dumpster fire. He overhauled that, and he uses that as a source of pride for people paying lower auto insurance rates right now. And he was also behind, even as Attorney General, some of the NDP's housing policies, because housing was in his category. So as a minister, he was seen as kind of the do-it minister. But then as Premier, there was all eyes were on him as to whether he could keep up this momentum and fulfill some of the promises he made, especially around housing. And now in the 2 years, he put a lot of housing bills on the table. And I think one of the big decisions that EB had to make was whether or not to call an early election. He could have called a spring election, especially to capitalize on the rift between BC United, which still existed, and the BC Conservatives. But he insisted that he wanted to stick with the fixed election date in order to, he wanted to fulfill that promise. And now a lot of people are saying maybe that was a mistake. And something that EB had said is that he wanted people to see, feel, and touch the changes that he put in, especially on housing.
Give me a little bit of a Coles Notes on what he's done on housing and whether people think that it's enough to move the needle on, the country's most unaffordable housing market.
Yes. Well, so there's one big policy was to force municipalities to meet housing targets. So really taking away some of the land use planning that municipalities have and saying you have to build X number of homes. If not, we will approve these homes for you. So that ruffled some feathers with municipalities and with local mayors. Another policy plank or legislation was that if you have a single family lot, if a house gets torn down, you could now build up to 6 units on that single family lot. And then also a middle class housing plan, which would allow people with incomes of up to 180,000 household income to be eligible for a below market unit in sort of a rental. So acknowledging that there are people who are making up to $180,000 between two people who still can't afford to buy a house. So those are some of the policy examples. But again, I still think that people are waiting to see the effects of that affordability, and house prices have not come down.
Yeah. And has Rustad and the Conservatives had any success attacking him on that front? What have they been saying? I imagine this is what, if not the most important issue in this election, top three?
Definitely top three. And so I think, again, on housing, I've talked to some experts who have said, the only thing Rustad has focused on is his Rustad rebate, which would reduce people's, give people a tax cut on the amount they pay on rent.
What we are announcing today is what we're calling the Rustad rebate. We are going to have a tax deduction of up to $3,000 per month for people that are paying the rent or paying their mortgages.
One thing Rustad has said is that he thinks the private sector has more of a role to play. So there's a bit of a back and forth between whether the government should be the one to build these below market housing, or what Rustad says is if you remove the red tape, that reduces costs for builders, and that will naturally bring down prices. Well, again, in the sort of early 2000s, when we saw house prices completely soar, we didn't see the private sector, magically offer prices for below market, right? They want to make a profit. So there is some skepticism as to whether these private developers are going to build, say, apartment buildings that families could live in.
You mentioned that Eby has backtracked on a couple of key issues as well. He's tacked further to the right. So the carbon tax, despite being someone who championed it for years. Earlier this year, his government rolled back drug decriminalization in the province, another big issue. He has been labeled like a flip-flopper. Do you think that this tack to the right has helped him?
I think that, I think there were certain issues that Eby could see the political winds shifting. I think from a political perspective, the carbon tax was problematic, and we've seen other premiers move away from it as well.
Andrew Furey, the latest of 7 premiers calling on Ottawa to cancel this spring's carbon tax hike. BC, the Northwest Territories, and Quebec have their own carbon pricing programs, so they're exempt from the federal plan. Nearly all the provinces that aren't now united.
Eby was the only premier in the country who was standing behind the carbon tax. So now it's all eyes are pointing on Trudeau, and it basically really what Eby was doing was basically passing the buck to Trudeau and saying, okay, you can blame that guy. Interestingly, the BC Conservatives have tried to saddle Eby with Trudeau.
Today we actually saw David Eby come out and he says he's going to be campaigning against his own government's policies. I find that quite incredible, and I guess what it comes down to is he's torn between two lovers, whether it is Jagmeet Singh or whether it is Mr. Trudeau.
They have attack ads showing Eby and Trudeau together, basically saying they're one and the same. So I think that's another example of how the BC Conservatives are closely aligned with the federal Conservatives and are trying to, they're seeing the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau, and they're trying to attach Eby to that.
The tack to the right on other issues like drug decriminalization, for example, is that widely seen as the right political move for Eby because it's popular?
Well, I think a lot of advocates I talked to, they said we cannot rely on decrim alone to fix the drug crisis, fix the opioid crisis. It's one part. It has to come with treatment. It has to come with safe supply. But I think there was too much emphasis on just decriminalization without those underlying supports. And so there was a perception that more people were doing drugs in the street, that, children couldn't go to a playground without drug use being there, or, needles being left behind. And so it was a short-lived experiment, and I think, again, politically, Eby saw there was a problem there and the public was not behind it. So he kind of did a middle ground where decriminalization is technically still in play, but it's illegal to use drugs in public spaces. The drug policy issue has been very difficult, and I don't know if anyone has the answer, to be honest. It's a tough situation out there.
Look, I know that you and I have been knee-deep in policy, which has been really helpful. But I actually, before we go, do just want to talk about Chip Wilson, the
most charming billionaire in Canada.
Oh, yes. The founder of Lululemon, just because it's funny. And just, can you tell me about Chip Wilson and his connection? Why am I talking to you about Chip Wilson in an episode about the BC election?
Well, Chip Wilson has an $80 million home on the waterfront in Point Grey, which is David Eby's riding. And he has put up several billboards. The first billboard basically called the NDP a communist party. Another second billboard railed against taxes, basically saying you're stealing money out of people's pockets. And, Eby has used this as an example of saying, you know what, if Chip Wilson, I'm not his guy, that's fine. He is John Rustad's guy because Rustad wants to put in policies that will only help billionaires, that will only help the 1%.
I would just say to Mr. Wilson, people are struggling out there, and we need to provide support to them. And I respect the work that he's done in creating companies. I think that's great. But I don't regret raising the taxes on his $80 million mansion.
So it's ironically been harmful to the BC Conservatives, I think, because it's allowed the NDP to say, if you want the billionaires in the BC Conservatives, you can take them. But we're fighting for the average middle-class voter who can't afford an $80 million mansion. So that's why we're talking about him. And actually Rustad came out after the second sign and he said, "Sorry, Chip, you're not going to get any of our tax cuts." So even Rustad had to come out and disconnect himself from Chip Wilson.
Chip Wilson's like the big loser in this already. Final question. Very briefly, Katie, I said at the start of this conversation that this was a very tight race. It is Friday. People are going to go to the polls on Saturday. How tight is it right now?
I mean, it's so tight that it's very likely that maybe some of the independents could play a role. Of course, there are some MLAs who are, incumbents who were with BC United, were completely orphaned when the party collapsed, but didn't want to throw in the towel. However, the big question mark is those independents, who would they work with? Would they work with the Conservatives? Would they steer to the right, or would they steer more to the left? So I think that could be the big X factor, is the independence, and that's going to be something we'll be watching right up until the dying hours of voting on Saturday. They say they call BC the Wild West of politics. So I think this campaign is meeting that threshold.
Yes, it's really a lot going on over there. Katie DeRosa, thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
That is all for this week. Front Burner was produced this week by Joyita Sengupta, Iman Bare, Matthew Amha, Aja Sauter, and Ali James. Special thanks to Sarah Jackson. Sound design was by Mackenzie Cameron and Sam McNulty. Music is by Joseph Shabison. Our senior producer is Elaine Chow. Our executive producer is Nick McCabe-Locos, and I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.